Hello and welcome to another recording from a Garden Masterclass. We do these once a week, which we post on YouTube as a public service broadcast. Eventually they go into our members archive. Garden Masterclass puts on live events in Britain, day workshops for garden and landscape people, but we also have a terrific webinar program which we run from October through to April. And all those webinars get recorded and are made available from our online library. If you join Garden Masterclass, you can get those at a discount, and you'll also be able to have access to a series of podcasts we're doing. We've recently launched a podcast channel on Substack. Some of that is free. We aim to do a free one every week, but there will also be exclusive members content, a lot of which will be really seriously information packed. So if you're going to be driving or weeding or busy doing something, you can listen to us as well. So do please keep in touch with Garden Masterclass at gardenmasterclass.org. See the amazing range of things we do, and sign up for our monthly newsletter. And if you really like what we do please come and join us. Now, without any more further ado, I'd like to introduce Polly Nicholson, who has written a very learned and really beautiful book with Phaidon on tulips, very specifically on older varieties and species tulips. And her work, which she discusses in the book, is very much in the context of the new way we're really looking at tulips. Last year we had a wonderful webinar from Cassian Schmidt about the tulip populations that have been going for so many years at Hermanshof. We've also done a webinar with Jacqueline van der Kloot in the Netherlands, again looking very much at sustainable long-term growing of tulips. So before perhaps we should start at the beginning, and Polly, ask you, when did you first get interested in gardening? Before perhaps you moved into tulips. What was your first green experiences?
My first experience was growing up in an English country house with a beautiful garden around me, with, I think, not a single flower in the whole garden. Because my parents, they were fantastic with trees and lawns, and my mother's quite good with containers, but they didn't do herbaceous beds at all. And actually, I think that has had an effect on how I garden now in this garden. So my experience was very much growing up in a beautiful environment, but a flowerless environment. But nevertheless, I sought out flowers wherever I went, and I was sort of slightly mocked at university for always going and picking flowers in the Devonshire countryside and bringing them back to my student room. And I think they thought I was a bit odd. Left university and went straight into Sotheby's as an antiquarian book specialist. It was much easier back then. It's almost impossible now. But my family is well known for antiquarian books, and I'm fourth generation of a family business. So when nepotism was encouraged, off I went to Sotheby's with the right sounding name, which was Bainton, for Bainton's Books in Bath, George Bainton's, and now Bainton Flowers, that's my maiden name. And I started cataloguing gardening books and cookery books. So that was what really piqued my interest, was cataloguing the early herbals and Florilegium. So things like Gerard's Herbal, Basilius Besler's Hortensis, that type of book where the earliest tulips were depicted from 1613 onwards. So it's an unusual route in, really. But I then did my time at Sotheby's, got married, and while raising a young family, I retrained at Chelsea Physic Garden on their practical horticulture course. And that was where I suppose I realized that it was the growing, and I would say particularly growing rather than gardening, which became my passion.
Right, you say growing rather than gardening. Perhaps you could enlighten us a little bit on the distinction.
I don't call myself a gardener as such, because I feel that with the gardening I'm learning the whole time and learning quite slowly. Whereas with the growing, I feel that I sort of fast-tracked when we moved to the countryside, and
Mm,
I started growing in really quite considerable quantities very quickly. And I was sort of 35 or 36. We inherited this garden, which is a series of walled gardens, and it wasn't neglected, but certainly the borders were pretty empty. And I filled them up on arrival. And my bulb of choice was the tulip.
mm,
Whether I was drawn to it, and whether it was something that was going to be such a big part of my life, or whether it was something that was easy and simple to grow, I'm not sure.
mm.
Combination of the two. But I filled up the borders with tulips, and that was the beginning of my passion for tulips. At
Right.
the same time, I started, or rather over the next few years, I started this small business, which was a cut flower business.
Mm.
And that became something which was quite, I suppose, well thought of, certainly within the floristry world, because people could buy flowers which were properly grown in the UK rather than having to import.
Right, right. Yes, yes. So when you started growing tulips, I mean, did you just sort of tick a few, pages in the bulb catalogues and try all sorts, or when did you really begin to focus?
Um, I was driven very much. I have a very strong aesthetic, which is sometimes a bad thing because I know what I do and don't like. So I was drawn initially just to the colours and the shapes which appealed to me, with no knowledge at all about their flowering times. I didn't know when a single early would flower as opposed to a double late. Um, is my screen all right? Oh, you've got the slides going up.
Yeah,
Fantastic.
yeah.
Um, and I learned on the job. So I would start by choosing just simply what appealed to me. And then I realized that I could draw my season out by being much more strategic with my purchases.
Right, right. And now you mentioned in the book Hortus bulborum. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, have you been to Hortus Balborum?
I haven't, I'm afraid. No, no. So
Okay, good.
it
Let
excites
me
me.
explain it to you. Um,
Yes.
so if you go to Amsterdam in tulip season, you'll be directed to Keukenhof, which I suspect most of your listeners have heard about, which is a tulip festival which stretches over several weeks
Mm,
and
mm.
is more tulips than you could ever possibly imagine. I don't know how many hundreds of thousands or even if it's into the millions, but it's fields of tulips, and some of them absolutely beautifully combined together. Some of them just fields of literally striped tulips, so it looks like barcodes. So I did that, and that was very exciting, but a sort of an overload. And then I went in the other direction, which is northwest of Amsterdam, to a place called Limmen, to visit Hortus Balborum. And I took this trip with our then head gardener called Hannah Gardner,
Mm,
who
mm,
was with me for a very formative 9 years
mm, mm.
since we've been at Blacklands. And we had awful trouble finding it. We got the train and then we tried to get a bus, and we ended up hitching a lift in the cab of a lorry, which I think is really normal for Hannah because she's an intrepid plant hunter, but it was slightly less normal for me. But I thought, okay, we'll go with it's an adventure. And we discovered this living museum of tulip bulbs, not just tulips, hyacinths, narcissi, and another curated selection of spring bulbs, mostly spring bulbs. And we hit peak flowering period for some of the earlies, but missed the real gems, which were the breeder and broken ones, which are the nexus of their collection.
Mm, mm,
Um, and essentially, it's a rare breed tulip. Farm is the wrong word because they sell a few, but it's not farmed, but rare breed tulip collection, dating back to tulips that were grown from the late 1500s. And it was founded by a very foresightful young teacher and horticulturalist in 1928, I think, and is now manned by volunteers.
mm,
But
mm.
2,500 different varieties of old or rare tulips, as well
Right.
as a
Yeah.
large quantity of species tulips.
Yes, yes. Because the Netherlands, of course, is so linked with the tulip. It's very much the kind of national symbol almost.
Mm.
And tulip mania. I know as it was one that is the next thing people will tell you, this extraordinary historical episode, which I know economists still argue about. And I believe I don't know whether you can cast any light on this, but there was another scandal probably about 10, 15 years ago about investing in tulips. There was, as I understand it, fairly quickly covered up. Do you know
Tell
anything
me
about
more.
that?
I'm intrigued. I don't know about
No,
this.
no. Okay. Well, I've not been. Well, I've not. That's about as much as I know. But I remember, when I used to go to Holland, rather more than I do now, and the people were
Yeah.
sort of mutter about this. Oh well, they're at it again. The tulip breeders, people who invested all this money and they've lost it, and nobody'll talk. And interesting, interesting.
Right. Okay. Well,
Yes,
yeah. I need to dig a bit deeper with that one.
yes.
But certainly these old tulips have always been contentious
Mm,
because one of the reasons why they would fetch such ridiculous amounts of money, back in particularly in the period 1634 to 37, which, as you say, was called tulip mania, was because these plain coloured tulips, in fact, case in point, the screen showing the image on the screen now, these breeder tulips, which are
wow.
plain coloured, would break into what we call broken tulips, which would be flamed and feathered and marbled and spotted and jaspis and all these incredibly romantic descriptive names. And they couldn't work out what was causing them to break. They tried every which way to make them break by sprinkling different coloured pigments on the soil and binding halves together and so forth. And sometimes it happened, sometimes it didn't. But it was only discovered in the 1920s in the UK by a lady called Dorothy Cayley at the John Innes Institute, that it was
Mm,
aphids that were causing these bulbs to break, because they'd feast on a broken one and then they'd go on to a breeder one, and then that would, as if by magic, break. So the bulb industry was absolutely, and still is absolutely, petrified about their stocks of their nice supermarket type tulips, or the ones which they're selling to us by their billions to plant in our gardens, that they would be infected by this tulip breaking virus, and that they wouldn't be able to sell their tulips anymore. As they wouldn't do what they said on the tin as such, that they would go from being, nice pink plain one to a pink stripy one,
mm.
which
Of
we
course,
might love, but not the general consumer, perhaps.
yes, interesting thought. Actually, one might imagine that if any were to sort of ever get out, there might be quite a kind of mad scramble to obtain some of these. Everyone
Well,
charging into Tesco because there's rumours of a broken tulip.
Well, I know, and of course it does happen in nature still, spontaneously. And I get lots of inquiries from people who say, I've got this extraordinary tulip and it's broken, and what do I do with it? And I always say just enjoy it, because it is
Yeah.
a thing of beauty, and it's almost like this sort of blast from the past.
Yes.
In a
Yes.
garden context, it just doesn't matter to the general gardener or grower if their other ones end up doing the same thing. It's rather exciting. So I
Yeah.
think,
Mm,
don't fret. But then I'm
mm.
not really commercial, so I don't have to worry.
Yeah.
What I
Yeah.
what I do have to be really careful about with my old tulips is that I don't infect the breeder ones with
Mm,
tulip
mm.
breaking virus. So I have to keep the bulbs as far away from each other as possible at every stage of the growing,
Right.
um,
Yeah.
and the storage and the rest of it. So
Yeah.
that's really important.
Mm, mm, mm. So Hannah Gardner, I mean, she has quite a name as a bulb expert, and she worked with you for some years then.
Mm. Yes, she did. And in fact, she was the one who, in the first instance, I think she thought I was bored is the wrong word, but I'd worked my way through a lot of different annual tulip cultivars by the time she actually started working here. And we found a tulip, and I think it was in a Parker's catalogue called Dom Pedro. And she said, let's try this. I think it's an older one. So we ordered a quantity of Dom Pedro, dates from 1911. And when it came up the following May, because these old tulips often flower very late, I'd never seen anything like it. It was much more, it had a sort of reverence to it, which was unlike any of the other tulips which I'd bought till that point. It was the first time I hadn't been able to describe a colour of a tulip.
Wow.
Um,
Wow.
it was now having written the book, I think I probably said something like it was burnt mahogany or burnished conker or something like that. But it had basically it was a deep polished brown color with bronze overtones, and it just felt like it felt antique as
Yeah.
opposed to modern, and indeed it was. You know, it's
Yeah.
blood. It was over 100 years old.
Fascinating. And that
Yeah,
kind of really got you excited and wanting to find more.
yeah. And then I started collecting from there, and ended up some years later, I think in can't remember what year I actually, whether it was 2016 or 2018, but I ended up having the National Collection of Historic Tulips with Plant Heritage
Right. Yes.
after a long application process and inspections and so forth. And I've continued building the collection since then.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. So is this a collection that people can come and view, or do you have open days, or how does that work?
So we have two main open days for the National Garden Scheme, where we have 300 people on each day who come at peak tulip period. And then I do a certain number of days for charities like Maggie's Cancer Care or Horatio's Garden, where I sell tickets to raise money for the charities, and all the ticket money goes to the charities. And then I have small groups of specialists who come around the garden as well.
Yeah.
And people are, I mean, you don't have to be knowledgeable to enjoy these tulips. They speak to you on so many different levels. So
Yes.
often people won't come knowing a great deal, and then they'll leave knowing quite a lot when they've been immersed in them. That one dates from 1620, for instance,
Wow.
the one
Yes.
we're looking at.
Amazing they've been able to survive.
Yeah.
In the book, you mentioned the Wakefield and North of England Tulip Society, which is one of those bodies that perhaps a lot of us have heard about, but don't know very much about. And the immediate thought is, why Wakefield? So could you tell us a bit more about what they do?
Yeah, the society was founded in 1836, and at its sort of peak time in the mid 19th century, I think there were possibly up to 200 different tulip societies in the United Kingdom. And
Wow.
there was a big cluster of them up in the Yorkshire area. So Wakefield became synonymous with the tulip. And it was working men, often cobblers, who would grow them in their backyards and their allotments as a sort of counterpoint to the drudgery of the day. So it was cobblers and a very surprising group. And they became expert in selective breeding. So they would pick out the features they liked best, and they would grow those tulips on from their offsets, which are the daughter bulbs or bulblets, which would come off the main bulb, and take care of the mother main bulb as well. And they would dispose of the ones which didn't have the form and the patterns which they were after. So what we have now in the UK is one tulip society. It's the only surviving tulip society, which has an annual show every May, which I compete at along with other fanatics. And they're still judged very much according to their form, which is essentially a slightly flattened version of the tulip, the Dutch style tulip as we know it. It's meant to be a shallow bowl shape, or take a tennis ball and cut it in half, and that's your perfect shape. And it has to correspond to one of three colorways, which are called rose, Bibleman and Bazaar. So Rose and Bibleman have a white base. Rose is pinker, Bibleman is a purpler, and the Bazaar has a yellow base with a sort of orange to reddish petals. And then they have to be flamed or feathered. So it's a lot of different criteria, but it makes for the most beautiful show bench you can ever imagine.
I can imagine. Wow.
I mean,
Yes.
it's like it's jewels lined up all the way along, and you imagine picking out all of the tulips from your Boscharts and your Bruegels and your Jacob Marel paintings, and then putting all of those on a show bench, and that's what you get.
Yeah, there's just so you make it sound really quite extraordinary. Yes.
And
Yes.
fierce competition, may I add.
Really. Yeah.
No, I mean all good natured, but
Yes.
it is really very competitive, and there are cups, and the show results are reported afterwards, and
Yeah.
it, anyone who's got the bulbs, and I hasten to add, you can't buy the bulbs, nor would I ever sell the bulbs.
No.
That it's an exchange instead. But anyone who's part of the society, has the right to turn up, even if
Okay.
it's with one flower.
Yes. So I was wondering, any national collection holder is engaged in all sorts of ways of trying to add to the collection. I imagine with this, it's probably particularly challenging. I mean, how have you been able to source many plants in the collection?
Well, the English florists' tulips are all through the society. So in a way, that's a simpler way of doing it, although it's very slow. So, for instance, this year I've received a package already with 12 individual breeder bulbs, and I'm hoping to get my broken ones to follow. And then with the Dutch historic ones, it's a combination of scouring all the catalogues for names that I don't know, and checking that they're not brand new, and that's why I don't know them. I will go on to the Royal Dutch Bulb Growers Association website, KAVB, and cross-reference any name of a bulb with that and find out when it was introduced. And if I then find out that it's, says that actually it was, 1760, and it was evidently a really old historic one, I'll snap it up as quickly as possible. But there's a few of the online websites. So Jack Amond, they specialize in historic bulbs. So they've been fantastic, and very supportive of what I do. And then there's a few other private people as well. But of course, now with Brexit, it's got very hard, because I can't just sort of go to the Netherlands and say, yes, I'll have a few of those and a few of those. But Hortus bulborum is selling some of the old breeder and broken bulbs at the moment, and they are shipping to the UK. So if there's very keen listeners, go to the Hortus bulborum website and place an order for that.
Right. Yes.
They're not cheap though, so be warned.
Yes. Yeah, I'm sure.
Nothing to do with these old tulips is cheap.
No. Now moving on, you grow a lot of species tulips as well, which I imagine are a very different proposition. And you've had quite a bit of experience in growing them in borders alongside other plants, naturalizing them. And how do you find them as permanent garden plants?
Well, I think they're the future of permanent garden tulips. They repeat flower much better than most of the annual garden tulips we use. And I have learned to prefer their effect in a herbaceous border than to have your Darwin hybrids or your Triumphs or whatever marching through the border. Once you plant them, and once they establish themselves, and I should add, they don't always work. It is trial and error at the beginning, but once they're happy, they tend to multiply really well, by a combination of bulb, stolon, or seed. And we've now got some really good populations here in the garden. So I would urge, I mean, for UK listeners, Tulipa sylvestris, which is the woodland tulip, also known as the wild tulip, that has established really well here.
Yes, yes.
And I had the pleasure of actually being at Gravetie a couple of days ago with Tom Coward.
Oh,
And
yeah.
that was, of course, the home of William Robinson, who wrote
Yeah,
The Wild Garden in 1870.
yeah.
And he was establishing sylvestris at the further reaches of the garden then. And Tom is doing great things with species tulips there now.
Yeah, yeah.
So
Very interesting.
yeah, I get very excited by them because they don't, even the planting of them doesn't disrupt a herbaceous border in the
No.
same way that a planting of a sort of 11 centimeter new bulb does.
Right,
And then
yeah.
once they're in, you leave them in.
Yes, yes. I mean, the conventional wisdom on them is that they need a good summer baking,
Yeah.
so not too
Well,
much.
in fact, that picture you just saw of a log pile, that's got all my species tulips, which are in containers,
Yes.
under it, having a simulated summer baking.
Mm.
So as soon as they've flowered, I deadhead them to put the energy back into the bulb,
Yeah.
and then they all get put under cover
Mm.
until about November. So they're kept bone dry.
Yes.
And then the idea is that they dry out as they would in the wild.
Mm.
And then, of course, what we'd really like is a nice cold patch, perhaps not as cold as the snow on those pots, but we
Yes.
want a nice cold patch to start a vernalization period to kickstart the growth and to clean the soil and everything. It has wonderful, the cold, and then they'll start growing again. But of
Right.
course, it doesn't always work out like that, and you can have a very warm, wet winter,
Mm.
which can cause havoc with tulips, as we all know.
Yes, yes. Um, so I mean, how many could be treated as just real plant them and well, dare I say it, forget about them?
Yeah, well, I speak only from my own experience because everything in the book is very much how I've
Yes.
done it and how in the ways we've experimented here. But we have sylvestris in what we call the woodland beds.
Yeah.
We have Whittalii, Tulipa, Orphanidae, Whittalii group through a long herbaceous border. And that works really well because it holds onto its petals for a very long time after
Yes.
flowering.
Yes.
So I tend not to deadhead that. And
Yes.
then we have Sprengerii, which I was given in quite a decent quantity from Sarah Cook, which flowers through all of our Benton irises. Then we have another border full of peppermint stick, which is a Clusiana hybrid, and that's taken off really well. And several other colonies. We have a Cuminata, which is now called Cornuta, growing in grass. We have
Oh,
Axibensis down by the river.
yeah.
So we're doing quite well with it here.
Yes. Yes.
But you have to work out what works for your soil. And ours is very free draining
Yeah.
and free draining yet quite rich.
Yes.
And you have to work out what aspect they grow best in. I say by starting them off in containers. So buy 10 or 2 dozen and put them in a container. See what the foliage does, see when they flower, see which way they move. And then once you've got to know it, try a naturalized planting outside.
Um, and I also understand they're quite sort of potash hungry. Something to do perhaps with just a nutrient availability in particularly Central Asia, where you get this very, very short growing season and high nutrient availability in a short period of time.
Yeah, well, we feed with a seaweed feed, dilute
Yeah.
seaweed
Oh,
feed.
yeah. Yeah.
So that makes sense. Makes me laugh. It's called Shropshire seaweed, and those of you who know the United Kingdom,
Utterly bizarre.
there's no coast in Shropshire, so it's presumably
Yeah.
processed there. But yeah, we feed the containers through the flowering period,
Yes.
and we
Yes.
also feed the whole historic collection
Yes.
during the flowering period, and then they get one water and feed after flowering, and then
Yes.
after that they're starved.
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
As you
Yeah.
say, we pretend we're Central Asia for a few months of the year.
Yes. 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 And then you it's interesting how you refer in the book to annual tulips, which is a sort of very honest description of a lot of the
Mm,
commercial tulip varieties, which uh, basically do only really perform well for one year and then never flower again.
mm.
But you're quite keen that we in fact should perhaps address this, and the fact there are ways perhaps of growing them in a more sustainable fashion, because otherwise it is actually an extremely wasteful practice, both of money and of
Time.
resources,
Yeah,
buying
exactly.
tulips that only
And
ever flower
fuel. This
Yes.
shipping them in the whole time. Yeah, I didn't know whether to call that chapter annual or garden or hybrid tulips, because all
Yes.
of those terms are used.
Mm,
But
mm.
what I wanted to make the point there and throughout the book is that we should think about growing tulips in a different way,
Yes. Yeah.
which is a more environmentally friendly way, um,
Yes. Yes.
which works in. I have. I don't know if I mentioned yet, but I have organic status with the Soil Association UK.
Right. Yes. Yes. Yes.
So that has to be our sort of abiding principle with everything we do.
Yes.
Also, it's very tricky with tulips because not many are available to be bought as organic bulbs at all.
No. No.
So I buy as many as I can, I suppose as I can afford and justify organically. And
Mm,
then I buy a quantity which will be from the big Dutch bulb suppliers. And once they hit my soil, they'll be grown organically.
yes. Yes.
Which means I can't, for my cut flower side of my work, I can't then sell those ones as certified organic flowers for that first year because they're
No.
not were bought as non-organic.
Yes.
But they get grown organically when they're here.
Mm,
The ones which are sold for the cut flower industry, I can't recycle because I harvest the bulb with the flower. And so once the flower's been cut from the bulb, there's nothing in terms of stem or leaves to
mm, mm.
photosynthesize back into the bulb. So those are composted.
Right. Right. Yeah.
But all of our containers are filled with these same annual tulips from the same suppliers, but I then dry those out after flowering. I deadhead them while they're still in the container,
Mm,
leave
mm.
them for a week or two in situ, and then they're all dried out on racks. And then come October, November, December, they're planted out in all the rough areas of the garden.
Ah, right. Mm,
So,
mm.
and there's pictures of that in the book. And then we create what I suppose as a counterpoint to the annual, you'd call a perennial display.
Yes.
Because the bulbs are perennial, it's just you have to accept that they are going to dwindle or sulk for the first year or two, and they'll get a much smaller flower. And you have to accept that you're not going to have these serried ranks of tulips, which are all
Mm,
uniform,
mm.
such as you'll still see in Kensington Gardens or somewhere
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that they're going to be all different sizes and different strengths.
Mm, mm.
And
But
you,
nevertheless, having some garden value. It's just that you have to accept that it's going to be
well,
different.
exactly. I mean, I now much prefer it in the same way I prefer the species tulips in a herbaceous bed. I now
Yes.
prefer to see these tulips
Mm,
naturalized.
yes.
That said, I would start off with a few new ones to get
Mm,
a
mm.
display going,
Yes.
and then
Mm.
we do supplement every year or two with about 20% extra
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
that we have a proper display.
Yes. Yes.
But it's nothing compared to if you went to a big public garden
Mm,
and you
mm.
saw their tulips, which are all ripped up and thrown away, and they start again. I mean, what we're doing is literally nothing compared to that.
Yes. Mm, 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 mm. Um, are there any of the conventional tulips? Are there any particular groups that are better than others at repeat flowering in your
Um,
experience?
yes, in my experience, I would start off with the lily flowered ones and
Mm,
the Floras.
yes.
The lily flowers seem to have a real vigor to them. I mean, actually, that picture in front, bottom left, is
Yes.
a lily
Yes.
flower.
Yes.
And the one I showed you earlier, the sort of magenta and white, this one here, this is lily flowered. That dates from 1620.
Mm.
called Loch Van Rain.
Yes.
They do have an enduring power that many of the others don't. So I start with them. I also love the reflex type tuples, so
Yeah.
they hold a special place for me. Viridiflora tulips, which all have the green in the petals, so viridiflora, green flower.
Mm.
Those do very well, and I think I may be wrong, but I think it's the extra green which helps increase the photosynthesis
Yes.
process. So they do well. And
Mm.
then Triumph tulips, they have an injection, a lot of them, of the old breeder blood in them.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think that helps. Mistress Mystic, Cairo, Gavota, Havran. I've got
Mm.
good experience with those.
Yes.
And
Yes.
then the Darwin hybrids, which again have an injection of species in them, they do quite well, some of those. So Ivory Floridal, although the head is so large, it can look out of context when it's naturalized.
Mm.
Light and Dreamy, very, very pretty one to try. Mystic Van Eyck, those all do well for me as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But they may not do well for the next person. So
No, right, right, right. I mean, purely anecdotally, I must say the number of times I've been quite surprised by seeing tulips repeat flowering kind of underneath beech hedges or in situations that just look very stressful, but in actual fact, I don't know, may favour their particular life cycle,
well,
which is
that
top in a fairly brief
exactly.
period.
Well, there's something to be said for that, for growing under beech hedges or under
Yes,
like deciduous cover, because when the tulips are coming into flower, there tends not to be the canopy overhead, so they're getting lots of
yes,
light.
yeah,
And then
yeah,
in the summer, the deciduous hedge is sucking out a
yeah,
lot of the moisture from the ground
yes, yes, yes.
and often protecting the tulips from any rain.
Mm,
So
mm.
what you don't want to, so that's a perennialized planting there on
Yes.
screen.
Oh, marvelous. Yeah.
Uh, and that's been going now for about 7 years.
Gosh, wow. How interesting. Mm.
Yeah, with a little bit of help every year or
Yeah.
two with some more.
Yes.
And
Mm.
those tulips will end up. Um, the brown sugar might not, because the big heads can look out of place in a
Yeah.
naturalized setting. But
Mm.
the Jan Roos and the smaller
Yes.
ones, they'll all
Yes.
end up in those verges.
Mm. Right. Right. And as for container planting, any particular tips for container planting?
Go large. Choose, case in point, choose big containers.
Yeah.
They're much easier to look after. You
Yeah.
can water them all in one go. You can check for slugs
Yes.
in one go.
Yes. Mm.
I find that a lot of smaller containers don't have the same impact, and then
No.
you find that the slugs are sort of hiding out in between them.
Yeah.
Yeah, so go large with containers,
Yes.
and
Yes.
choose your tulips as if you were picking a bunch of your favorite flowers. So think
Mm.
what colors you would put together.
Yeah.
You're picking a bunch of flowers, and then pick your bulbs accordingly.
Yes. Right. Right.
And ignore what other people do. Do what you like.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Um,
That's the flower field where I grow the cut flowers,
yes.
which is all fenced off.
Mm.
From you can
Mm.
see we have a big flock of Hebridean sheep who are
Yes.
not a good combination with
Yeah, I'm
tulips.
sure. I'm sure. But you also, as well as tulips, you have a business that produces cut flowers. I mean, what other flowers do you grow?
Well, that's the walled garden there. So
Yes.
that contains everything from clematis such as Arabella for cutting to a wide selection of peonies, including things like coral charm,
Mm.
Duchess de Nemours, um, different campanulas, astrantius. I mean, we have hundreds of different cut flowers each year.
Right. Right.
But
Well,
I am, funny enough, doing less of that and then doing more with the tulip collection and other specialist flower groups. So instead of spreading my net too wide, I'm
mm.
now concentrating on things like group peonies and irises and dianthus. So I'm looking at
Yeah.
selected groups in more
Yes.
detail.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah, but
Right.
so much to learn.
Yes. Yes. We've got a question from Ulla in Germany. Nearly all the old tulip varieties, broken, I have tried, have disappeared the following year and have never come back, in contrast to most of the other tulips.
Mm.
Normal or her fault?
I should have said this, I lift all my historic tulips every July.
Yes, yes.
Every one we have as I said, over 100, 150
Yes,
different cultivars, so thousands of bulbs. They all get lifted and dried.
yeah.
For me, they're too precious to leave in the ground to
Yes,
be eaten
yes,
by voles or rot.
yes. Right. Yeah,
But try lifting them. It's a lot of work,
yeah,
but it pays off.
yeah, yeah. Okay, right. Well, marvelous. Thank you. That was most interesting. And again, it adds to our sort of developing knowledge of sort of this new thinking abroad
Mm.
about growing tulips. And we haven't got it yet, but we hope to have a negotiation with Phaidon on having a members discount available on the book, which will be available from the
Fantastic.
members retail page on the website. So
It's
Polly.
called The Tulip Garden. It's very easy to remember.
Yes, yes. No, it's a great book. The usual wonderful Phaidon high production standards. And
I give a plug to the photographer, Andrew Montgomery.
oh right, yes, yeah,
He was
we've interviewed him before.
superb.
Yes, I think we've
And
got him lined up again for something. Actually,
he,
yes,
he
yes,
was
yeah,
excellent. And my friend Britt Willoughby Dyer, who also
yeah,
contributed. So
right,
it
yeah,
wouldn't be
yeah.
the book without them.
No, no. Good, great. Well, thank you very much, and well, good luck with your next tulip season.
Planting's about to begin.
Yes, yes, I
So
bet.
I,
Yeah,
I should say I
yeah.
also have a team who work with me, Andy and co. So I'm not single-handed. But
No.
thank you so much, Noel.
No, thank you, Polly.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.